Good morning, guys. It is about 6:30 in the morning. The sun just came up behind us, but today is a very special day because one, we're out here camping in the beautiful wilderness. We've got this amazing view. But number two is that tonight is actually a new moon. And this video is gonna be my first photography tutorial video. But before we talk about all that stuff, I think Victoria and I need to have a little bit of breakfast and some coffee. So let's give you guys a quick little tour of our campsite. So we have our tent, our little two-person tent. It's a Kelty Circuit 2. We have the place where we ate our food, the place where Victoria's washing dishes, and of course, we have this amazing view. So the goal for today is to actually shoot photos of the Milky Way. I know you guys were really interested in my Milky Way photo that I posted a couple weeks ago, so we're gonna do that. And I have this little janky setup here. These rocks stacked where I'm gonna set my GorillaPod to shoot the photos. And the goal is we'll have the tent, the lake, the mountain, and then I'm expecting the Milky Way to come right up over this peak. So that's gonna happen at probably midnight or so. So we've got quite a bit of time to kill until that happens. So we're just gonna hang out, swim, and have a little bit of fun. Today, I'm gonna be shooting on my Sigma 24mm f1.4. Now, you can shoot on pretty much any wide angle lens. It doesn't have to be 24mm. You could do like the Rokinon 12mm or any sort of lens like that. You just wanna make sure that it has a large aperture. So something like f1.8 or f4. The wider your lens, the longer you're gonna be able to make your exposure. So if you have a wide lens and it's only f2, you'll be able to expose a little bit longer. So that's nice. And then you're just gonna need some sort of tripod or GorillaPod to keep your camera stable. Other than that, you can pretty much shoot it on any camera that you guys might have. I've shot these photos on a Canon T4i, I've shot them on the Sony a6000, but today we're gonna be shooting them on my Sony a7 III. But keep in mind, the camera that you have doesn't really matter quite as much as the lens does. So make sure you have a fast lens, something like f1.8 or f1.4. All right, so we have about an hour until the sun goes down behind this ridge line. So since we're just kind of hanging out, waiting for it to get dark, we're gonna hike up to this ridge line up here, this lone little tree, and shoot some sunset photos. So I'm stoked. What do you think, babe?
It's gonna be pretty. The view's gonna be awesome.
Yeah. Should be a pretty epic view, so we'll show you guys some of those photos once we get up there. Okay, so it's finally starting to get dark. Victoria is gonna cook us some dinner, but I wanted to quickly go over some of the settings that we're gonna use to shoot photos of the Milky Way, because once it's actually dark, it's gonna be way too dark for me to actually film anything for you guys. So when it comes to shooting photos of the Milky Way, I usually like to take two photos. I'm gonna expose one photo for the foreground, which is pretty much everything except for the stars. And then I'm gonna expose one more photo for the actual Milky Way, and then we'll combine them in post-production. So we'll talk about that in post-production. But as far as settings go, for the foreground, you can pretty much use whatever settings you want. But for the Milky Way, there's a little rule that we need to follow that's gonna tell us how many seconds to expose our image. So basically, we take the number 500, we divide that by our focal length. So for me, I'm shooting on a 24mm, and that's gonna give us how many seconds we can expose the Milky Way before we start to see star trails. Now, we don't wanna see those star trails. We wanna make sure the stars are nice and sharp. So for me, if I take 500 divided by 24, I'm gonna be somewhere between 20 and 25 seconds for my exposure. Of course, you can do less than that, but you wouldn't wanna do more than 25 seconds. So depending on your focal length, it's gonna be a little bit different, but just take 500, divide that by your focal length, and that's gonna tell you the maximum number of seconds that you can expose your Milky Way for. So we'll talk about all the specific settings that I'm using for my Milky Way photo. Once we get home and hop into Lightroom, I'll show you guys all of the post-processing, but right now, we're gonna eat some dinner and then we'll be shooting some photos of the Milky Way. All right guys, so welcome for the first time ever to my Adobe Lightroom. It's kind of weird to not be in Premiere Pro, but it's about time I start doing some photography tutorials. And what better tutorial to start with than an awesome photo of the Milky Way. So I just went ahead and picked my favorite photo from the night, and you guys can see this is kind of what you can expect your images to look like before you edit them. So you can still see the Milky Way, you can see the stars, but there's not really that much detail. So that's why we're gonna go ahead and edit this photo to bring out all of those details and make it look super awesome. But before we talk about editing, let's quickly talk about my camera settings. So you can see I shot this photo at 20 seconds, f1.4, and ISO 10,000. Now the reason I shot this at ISO 10,000 is because this was going to be my foreground exposure like I mentioned in the video. However, I noticed that this was the only photo where I actually caught a shooting star. So that was pretty awesome, and I decided I wanted to have that star in my final edit. So instead of shooting two photos, one for the foreground and one for the Milky Way, I decided I would just edit this one photo because I do really want to have that shooting star in my photo. So let's go ahead and jump into the editing process. Now the first thing I do when I edit any of my photos is crop and straighten. So I'm going to crop this to 4:5, which is the largest size for Instagram, and then I'm just going to straighten it up a little bit. Now I'm not too worried if it's perfectly straight just for the sake of this tutorial, but if it were an actual photo that I was going to post, I would want to make sure that it was really straight. So we'll crop it just like that. I'm going to crop it nice and high because I want to make sure you're able to see the Milky Way. And now we're ready to edit our photo. Now the first thing I'm gonna do is actually make a virtual copy of this photo. So I'm gonna right click and I'm gonna go to create virtual copy. And now I have two copies of the same exact photo. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm gonna edit one photo for the Milky Way and the second photo I'm gonna edit for the foreground. And then we'll take these photos into Photoshop and combine them into one awesome looking photo. So let's go ahead and edit for the Milky Way first. Now I'm just gonna go ahead and use my Milky Way preset because it speeds up the process a little bit, but if you guys want, you can just pause the video and copy my settings as I'm scrolling through. However, I will put the preset in my selfie store for like $1 if you wanna support this video and just make your life a little bit easier. That preset will be linked down in the description below, but now we're ready to start editing. So the first thing I'm gonna do is actually come down and remove chromatic aberration and enable my profile corrections. So you'll see the photo gets a little bit brighter, but the second thing I'm gonna do is actually decrease my exposure until the Milky Way starts to look pretty good. So if you click on exposure, you can use the minus button to just bring your exposure down, you know, kind of slowly and incrementally. So that's the way I like to work with exposure. And I'm just gonna get it to where the Milky Way looks like it's a decent exposure. So something like that looks good. Here's our before and here's our after. You can see the details in the Milky Way are already starting to come out, but now I'm just gonna kind of play with the sliders and my curves a little bit just to make it pop a tiny bit more. So I'm gonna bring these blacks down, maybe bring these shadows down a little bit, and I'm gonna come to my curves, make it a tiny bit darker here, and maybe add a little bit more color to the Milky Way by bringing up my saturation. And that's looking pretty good. I might bump my clarity a tiny bit, but that's looking pretty great. Here's our before. And here's our after. So I would say that's pretty solid for the Milky Way. Now I could make it pop a lot more, maybe by bringing these midtones down, but I don't want to overdo it. I do want my images to look natural and kind of blend well. So I'm not going to overdo it too much. I might just bring this down a tiny bit. And I'm gonna go ahead and call that good. So let's move on to our foreground image now. So this one, I'm just gonna edit by hand because there's really not a whole lot to do. I'm gonna bring my exposure down. I'm gonna make sure I have my profile correction set. And then I'm just gonna kind of make sure it'll blend nicely with the Milky Way. So since it is dark outside, I don't want it to look like it's light outside in my foreground. So I'm gonna bring that exposure down. I'm gonna cool it off a little bit just so it blends a little bit more as well. Something like that looks pretty good. I'm gonna add a little bit of magenta, and we're already looking pretty solid as far as our foreground goes. Again, I'm not too concerned with the foreground. I just want to make sure it blends nicely. So I'm just doing a couple minor edits here. Now I'm going to take my brush and just kind of make this tint stand out a little bit more. So I'm just going to brush this tint like that. bring the exposure up a little bit. Maybe a little more. Come in and erase some of that. Like that, and I'm gonna sharpen it up quite a bit. So that looks pretty good. For the sake of the tutorial, I'm gonna say that that is a good foreground. Now we need to bring these images into Photoshop. And the way we do that is you can right click, go to edit in and click edit in Adobe Photoshop, or you can push Control E. So I'm gonna go to my first image, push Control E, and then I'm gonna go to my second image and again, Control E. So now we have both of our images in Photoshop. We have our foreground image and our Milky Way image, and we just need to combine the two images. So I'm gonna take this foreground image and put it on top of the Milky Way image and make sure they are lined up nicely like that. And now we just kind of need to cut out this bottom portion so that you can see the Milky Way through. So what I'm gonna do is duplicate my background layer, because if I do mess up, I wanna be able to start over. So I'm gonna duplicate that layer, and then I'm gonna start on my layer 1 and start to cut out this bottom half of the image. Now there's 100 different ways you can do this, but for this particular image, I'm just gonna use the magnetic lasso tool and just click and drag along the top of these mountains. So now that I have the bottom half of my image selected, all I have to do is go ahead and add a layer mask, which is this button right down here. We'll just click on it, and there you go. You can see we have black and white. So anything that's black is gonna not be visible on this layer, whereas white is visible. So since it's black, it's actually showing the layer underneath, which is our Milky Way. So now we have a pretty decent looking image, but it doesn't look great. So I like to just add a couple tweaks to kind of make it blend a little bit better. And the way I do that is actually with curves in Photoshop. So we're gonna click this little icon right here, and we're gonna click on curves, and that's gonna pull up a curves layer. Now we only want this curves layer to affect only the layer below it and not all of the layers. So if you hold Alt and click between the two layers, now the curves is only affecting the one layer below it and not every single layer. So I like to start with auto and just kind of see where that gets me. A lot of times it doesn't work great, but sometimes it does. So for this particular image, auto didn't really do much for me. So I'm just gonna go ahead and make my own adjustments just to try to blend these photos a little bit better. So I'm gonna just bring this down, make it a little darker. I do wanna make sure that the bottom half of my image is dark, because it is dark outside and it doesn't make sense to have it look, you know, like it's daytime. So I'm just kind of using these curves to make things a little bit darker, but I don't want to get too dark now. I don't want it too contrasty or things like that. So something like that looks pretty good. And now I'm going to come to my background image, which is my Milky Way image, and do the same thing. I'm going to add curves. I'm going to Alt and click between the layers so that it only applies to the layer below it. And then I'm gonna start with auto and see where that gets us. And again, auto didn't really seem to work too great in this instance, but I'm gonna make some tweaks just to try to make it look a little bit better. I'm gonna bring these highlights down like that, bring this down somewhere like that. Let me move this so I can see a little better. And something like that looks pretty good to me. So we can see this is without the curves and this is with the curves. And I would say that that is a pretty solid looking image. So there you go, guys, our final Milky Way image with a nice shooting star. So I know this can be a little bit of a process when it comes to editing these photos. A lot of people prefer to just edit for the Milky Way and not really worry about the foreground, but I like to have some foreground detail in my Milky Way photos as well. So for me, it's worth the extra effort to edit the photo twice and then combine it in Photoshop. But hopefully you guys learned something from this video. I know it's a little bit different than some of my other videos, but that's how I'm shooting photos of the Milky Way. So there you go, guys. My first photography tutorial on YouTube. Hopefully you learned a little something about how to shoot photos of the Milky Way and how to process those photos in Lightroom. But we've got about 6 miles until we're back to the car. So I'm gonna set the camera down, put it in my backpack, and focus on hiking. But if you enjoyed this video, do me a favor, hit that thumbs up button. If you really liked it, subscribe if you wanna see more. And if you have any questions, send them to me on Instagram at CodyBlue_. But until next time, we'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out, have a great week.